Let me tell you about the night that changed everything. And I mean everything. Like entire star systems started rewriting their military doctrines because of what happened in my bar. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The name's Krix and I run Zeph's Cantina. Well, technically I inherited it from my uncle Zeph after he got himself vaporized in a poker game gone wrong, but that's another story. Point is, I've been slinging drinks to the galaxy's finest collection of misfits, murderers and military washouts for the better part of 15 years. When you've got 4 arms and compound eyes, bartending comes naturally. You see everything, and you pour twice as fast as the competition. Zeph sits right on the edge of the neutral zone, which makes it the perfect pit stop for anyone looking to disappear, make deals or start fights. The clientele is what you'd politely call diverse and what I'd accurately call a walking interspecies incident waiting to happen. On any given night you might find Regelian smugglers arguing with Centauri merchants while a table of Andromedan mercenaries places bets on who'll throw the first punch. But this particular night, my regular troublemakers were holding court at their usual spots. Commander Throck, a 7-foot-tall walking tank from the Koreth Empire, was busy showing off his latest battle scars to anyone within earshot. The guy collected wounds like some people collect vintage wines, and he was about as subtle as a supernova. His species had conquered half the outer rim through sheer brute force and an apparent genetic inability to back down from a fight. Professor Quillex was perched at his corner table, all tentacles and superiority complex. The Zalathi were known for their telepathic abilities and their insufferable habit of correcting everyone else's thoughts before they'd even finished thinking them. Quillex had been kicked out of 3 different universities for academic arrogance, which is impressive when you consider that Zalathi universities are basically designed for academic arrogance. And then there was Captain Vex, nursing her usual synth whiskey at the bar. Half her body was cybernetic enhancements, and the other half was scar tissue. She'd been hunting bounties across the galaxy for 20 years, and her success rate was legendary. The woman could track a target through hyperspace and had once killed a mark using nothing but a fork and what she called creative leverage. These 3 had turned my bar into their personal kingdom of intimidation, and honestly, it was good for business. Nothing keeps the riffraff out like the fear of getting dismembered by professional killers. So when a lone human walked through my door, looking about as threatening as a damp towel, you could practically hear the collective snickering from across the room. The guy was maybe 5'10", brown hair, completely unremarkable, except for the fact that he was human. And humans, well, they were the galaxy's favorite punchline. Their planet had just lost a border skirmish to the Vegan Trade Federation, for crying out loud. The vegans are pacifists who fight their wars with strongly worded letters and economic sanctions. Getting beaten by them was like losing an arm wrestling match to a houseplant. This human, who I later learned was named Jake Murphy, walked up to my bar like he owned the place. Which, considering how most humans tended to skulk around like beaten dogs in mixed company, was either refreshing or suicidal. Probably both. Beer, he said simply, sliding onto a stool. Whatever's cold, I looked him over with all 6 of my eyes. He seemed calm, maybe even relaxed. Either this guy was completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just walked into a den of apex predators, or he was the most confident human I'd ever met. Spoiler alert, it wasn't confidence. It was something much more dangerous. But I didn't know that yet, so I poured him a Regelian ale and settled in to watch the show. Because in a bar full of killers, there's always a show. And humans, bless their fragile little hearts, always made for the most entertaining victims. Jake took a sip of his beer and made that face humans make when they're trying to pretend they're not dying inside. Rigelian ale has a kick like a quantum torpedo, and most species need at least 3 stomachs to handle it properly. But he kept drinking, which I had to respect on some level. That's when Commander Throck decided to make his grand entrance into the evening's entertainment. Well, Throck rumbled, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. What do we have here? A little pink mammal, all alone in the big scary galaxy. He flexed his primary arms, showing off biceps that could crush a shuttle engine. Tell me, human, did you get lost on your way to the petting zoo? Jake didn't even look up from his beer. Nope, just having a drink. The simplicity of the response seemed to confuse Throck for a moment. He was used to his victims either cowering in terror or puffing up with false bravado. Jake's complete lack of reaction was throwing off his whole intimidation routine. Just having a drink. Throck repeated mockingly. How precious. Did you know, little mammal, that my people conquered your pathetic Earth colonies before breakfast last Tuesday? We didn't even bother sending our good soldiers. This was news to me, but then again human military defeats were so common they barely made the galactic news feeds anymore. Jake's only response was to take another sip of his ale. Professor Krix decided this was his cue to join the fun. His tentacles writhed with what I recognized as barely contained glee. Fascinating specimen, isn't it, Commander? The human brain is remarkably primitive. Watch this. He focused his telepathic abilities on Jake, probably expecting to find the usual human mental landscape of fear, confusion, and poorly organized thoughts. Oh, this one thinks he's clever, Krix announced to the bar. He's actually trying to ignore us. How adorably naive. As if pretending we don't exist will somehow make his species less of a galactic embarrassment. A few other patrons had started to take notice now. Nothing draws a crowd like the smell of impending violence, and the scent was definitely in the air. A table of Dracorian traders moved closer, their scales rattling with anticipation. Even the usually antisocial Vorthan in the corner booth looked up from his datapad. Captain Vex swiveled on her stool to get a better view. Credit where credit's due, she said, her voice modulated by her cybernetic vocal cords. The little mammal has stamina. Most humans would have wet themselves by now. Give him time. Throck laughed. The night is young and humans are known for their weak bladders along with everything else. Jake finished his first beer and gently pushed the empty glass toward me. Another, please. His politeness was almost surreal in the face of the mounting hostility. I poured him a fresh ale, my compound eyes taking in every detail of the scene. There was something about this human that didn't fit the usual pattern. Most humans in mixed company moved like they were constantly apologizing for existing. This Jake Murphy character sat like he belonged here. You know what I love about humans. Krix continued, warming to his theme. They're so beautifully predictable, weak, stupid, and completely unaware of their limitations. It's like watching a child play with explosives while insisting they understand nuclear physics. More laughter rippled through the bar. Even some of the more peaceful species were chuckling now. Humans were such an easy target that mocking them had become something of a universal pastime. I heard, said one of the Dracorian traders, that humans actually believe they're a warrior species. They have this concept called military strategy, as if planning could somehow compensate for being made of soft tissue and wishful thinking. Strategy. Throck spat. Humans fight like they're afraid of getting hurt. My people fight like we're afraid of not getting hurt enough. There's a difference. Jake was halfway through his second beer now, still showing no signs of stress. If anything, he seemed to be relaxing, which should have been our first clue that something was seriously wrong with this picture. But we were all too busy enjoying ourselves to notice. That's when Commander Throck made his fatal mistake. And I mean that literally, though none of us knew it at the time. You know what the best part about your recent defeat was? Throck said, leaning against the bar with all the casual arrogance of someone who'd never met real consequences. It wasn't just that you lost to the vegans, it was how you lost, running away like scared children the moment things got difficult. For the first time since he'd walked in, Jake's hand paused on his glass. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I caught it. When you've got compound eyes, you notice the little details that matter. The reports said your soldiers were crying. Throck continued, clearly enjoying himself. Actually weeping as they retreated. Can you imagine? Warriors so pathetic they cry during combat. He laughed. A sound like grinding metal. My hatchlings show more spine when they're teething. Jake's grip on his beer glass tightened just a fraction. Still nothing dramatic, but there was something in his posture that had shifted, like a machine switching from standby to active mode. Of course, Professor Krix chimed in, his tentacles practically vibrating with malicious glee. What can you expect from a species that considers negotiation a viable alternative to conquest? Humans actually try to talk their way out of fights. It's almost adorable in its futility. The bar was getting louder now, with more patrons joining the fun. Someone in the back started making crying sounds, mimicking human soldiers. Another patron, a Kelleran whose species communicated through bioluminescent patterns, was flashing what I recognized as their equivalent of laughter. Jake took another sip of his beer, calm as could be, but I was starting to get a weird feeling in my secondary stomach. The one that usually warned me when the atmospheric processors were about to malfunction, or when someone was about to try paying their tab with counterfeit credits. That's when Professor Krix decided to get clever. You know what? He announced to the room, his telepathic abilities crackling with smug satisfaction. I'm going to take a little peek inside our friend's head here. See what a defeated human soldier really thinks about when he's cornered and humiliated. Now, Telepathic assault is technically illegal in most civilized systems, but Zeph's Cantina exists in that wonderful gray area where civilized doesn't really apply. Besides, Krix had done this party trick before, usually to great entertainment value. Most species have fairly straightforward mental landscapes. Fear, anger, embarrassment, the occasional violent fantasy that they're way too scared to act on. Krix closed his primary eyes and extended his consciousness toward Jake's mind like he was reaching for a piece of fruit. Easy pickings, right? Wrong. So very, catastrophically wrong. The moment Krix made mental contact, his entire body went rigid. All 6 of his tentacles snapped straight out like he'd been electrocuted, and his skin shifted through about 12 different colors in rapid succession. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish trying to breathe air. Well? Throck demanded. What's the little mammal thinking about? His mother? His mate? How much he wishes he was home. Krix's response was barely a whisper, and it was the kind of whisper that makes your blood freeze in your veins. Oh no, no. The professor's telepathic connection snapped back like a broken cable, and he actually fell off his chair. His skin had gone a sickly gray-green color that in Zelathi physiology indicates the kind of terror usually reserved for existential crises or encounters with cosmic horrors. What's wrong with you? Captain Vex asked, her cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on the shaking telepath. You look like you just tried to read the mind of a void walker. Worse, Krix managed, struggling to get back into his chair. Much worse. The laughter in the bar was starting to die down now. Krix wasn't known for being easily rattled. The guy had once telepathically interrogated a war criminal without flinching, and here he was, shaking like a leaf in a solar storm. What did you see? Throck demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. Krix looked at Jake, who was still sitting calmly at the bar, still working on his beer like nothing had happened. When the professor spoke, his voice was barely audible over the ambient noise of the cantina. I saw a graveyard, he whispered. A graveyard full of every way he's ever killed someone, and it's a very big graveyard. The bar went dead silent. Jake finished his second beer and pushed the empty glass toward me with the same polite gesture as before. Could I get another, please? This one's on me. He reached into his jacket, moving slowly and deliberately, and placed a credit chip on the bar. His voice was still calm, still friendly. But now it sounded different somehow, like the calm before a storm that's big enough to crack planets. I poured him a third beer with 2 of my hands, while my other 2 reached under the bar for the emergency comm system, because something told me we were about to need it. The silence stretched out like a taut wire, and everyone in the bar was staring at Jake like he'd suddenly grown a second head. Which, considering some of the species present, wouldn't have been that unusual. But there was something in the air now, something that made my carapace itch and my secondary nervous system fire warning signals. Commander Throck, being the kind of genius who'd probably try to arm wrestle a black hole, decided this was the perfect moment to escalate things physically. I don't care what the mind reader thinks he saw, Throck growled, pushing himself away from his table. Humans are weak, period, and I'm going to prove it. He stomped over to Jake, each footstep making the floor vibrate. 7 feet of muscle, bone, and bad decisions, moving with all the subtlety of an asteroid collision. The Korath Empire had conquered star systems with less firepower than what Throck carried in his left arm alone. Get up, mammal, Throck commanded, grabbing Jake's shoulder with one massive hand. Let's see how tough humans really are when they can't run away. Jake looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then up at Throck's face. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something that made my survival instincts scream at me to dive behind the bar and activate the emergency shields. I'd rather not, Jake said politely. I'm just trying to enjoy my drink. Throck's response was to physically lift Jake off his bar stool and shove him toward the center of the room. It should have been like watching a child push around a doll. Throck outweighed Jake by at least 200 pounds, and his species had bone density that could stop small arms fire. Jake stumbled a few steps, caught his balance, and turned around. He rolled his shoulders once, like he was working out a kink, and suddenly the entire atmosphere in the room changed. It's hard to describe what happened next. Jake didn't get bigger, didn't grow claws, or fangs, or any of the obvious physical changes you'd expect from a combat transformation. But somehow, he filled the space differently. Like he'd gone from being furniture, to being the most dangerous thing in the room. Okay, Jake said, and his voice was still calm, still reasonable. I tried to be polite. That's when all hell broke loose. Throck charged first, moving with the kind of speed that had made his species the terror of 3-star sectors. His primary fist came down like a sledgehammer, aimed directly at Jake's head, with enough force to crack Duracrate. Jake wasn't there anymore. I'm not talking about some fancy dodge or roll. 1 second he was standing in front of Throck, the next second he was somehow behind and to the left, and Throck's fist was smashing into the floor hard enough to leave a crater. Before the big alien could even register what had happened, Jake had grabbed a chair and brought it down across the back of Throck's skull with surgical precision. The chair exploded into splinters. Throck staggered, but didn't go down. Korath's skulls are basically natural armor plating. What he wasn't expecting was for Jake to already be moving again, using the momentum from the chair strike to pivot and drive his elbow into the cluster of nerve endings, just below Throck's secondary ribs. Throck went down like a felled tree, gasping and clutching his side. And Jake was already looking for his next target. Captain Vex had drawn her plasma pistol, because she was a professional and professionals don't wait to see how bad things get before they start shooting. Her cybernetic targeting system locked onto Jake's center mass, and she squeezed the trigger. Jake threw himself sideways, rolling behind an overturned table just as the plasma bolt seared through the space where his chest had been. The energy blast hit the wall behind him and left a smoking hole the size of a dinner plate. "Stay down, human," Vex shouted, adjusting her aim. "I've got thermal imaging and motion sensors. You can't hide from me." "Who said anything about hiding?" Jake called back, and I swear I could hear him grinning. That's when I learned something new about human combat doctrine. They don't just fight with weapons and strength. They fight with their environment. Jake grabbed one of the intact chairs and hurled it, not at Vex, but at the light fixture above her head. The chair smashed the fixture, sending sparks and debris raining down while simultaneously cutting the illumination in that section of the bar. Vex's thermal imaging was designed to work in normal atmospheric conditions, not in a cloud of superheated metal fragments and electrical discharge. While she was dealing with that, Jake was already moving again. He'd somehow gotten hold of a bottle of Andromedan fire whiskey, which burns at about 3,000 degrees, and is technically classified as a chemical weapon in some systems. He lit it with a spark from the damaged fixture, and threw it at the group of Dracarian traders who were trying to circle around behind him. Dracarians are lizard-based, which means they're cold-blooded, which means sudden exposure to extreme heat tends to make them sluggish and confused. The fire whiskey bottle exploded in their midst, and suddenly 3 of my regular customers were rolling around on the floor, hissing, and trying to put out their scales. Professor Quillex, meanwhile, was trying to get into Jake's head again, probably figuring that telepathic assault was safer than the physical kind. Big mistake. The moment Quillex's consciousness touched Jake's mind, the professor screamed like he'd grabbed a live fusion conduit. He fell backward off his chair, all his tentacles convulsing, and started babbling in what I think was his species' equivalent of religious prayers. Jake wasn't even paying attention to him anymore. He'd moved on to the Vorthan who'd been trying to flank him from the corner booth. Vorthans are known for their speed, and their retractable claws, which can cut through most body armor. This particular Vorthan was a veteran of the Cygnus border wars, and had reflexes like a striking snake. Jake picked up a fork from one of the tables. A fork, a simple 3-pronged eating utensil made of basic metal alloy. The Vorthan lunged, claws extended, moving fast enough that most species would have just seen a blur. Jake sidestepped the attack with minimal effort, and drove the fork into a pressure point on the Vorthan's neck that I didn't even know existed. The alien dropped like his strings had been cut, not dead, but completely paralyzed from the neck down. "How did you know where to?" the Vorthan started to ask, then stopped, probably realizing he didn't want to know the answer. By this point, Captain Vex had cleared the debris from her targeting system, and was lining up another shot. But Jake had anticipated that too. He'd been using the chaos to position himself near the bar's industrial-grade sonic dampener, the device I used to keep the noise levels from driving away customers who didn't appreciate having their eardrums shattered by drunken Regelian singing. Jake grabbed the dampener's control cable and yanked it free, then threw the sparking end directly at Vex's cybernetic components. The electrical feedback overloaded her targeting system and sent her staggering backward, clutching her head as her neural interfaces went haywire. Commander Throck was starting to get back up, his natural Korath resilience overcoming the nerve strike. But Jake was already there, and this time he wasn't holding back. He grabbed a broken piece of the chair he'd used earlier and drove it into the soft spot behind Throck's primary knee joint, a weakness that most people didn't know existed, unless they'd studied Korath anatomy extensively. Throck went down again, and this time he stayed down. The entire fight had lasted maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds, and Jake had systematically neutralized every threat in the room, using improvised weapons, environmental advantages, and a level of anatomical knowledge that was frankly terrifying. He'd fought like someone who'd studied every species in the galaxy, specifically to learn how to kill them most efficiently. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what he'd done. Jake walked back to the bar, stepping carefully around the unconscious and groaning bodies scattered across the floor. He picked up his beer, which had somehow survived the chaos intact, and took a long sip. "Sorry about the mess," he said to me. Like he was apologizing for spilling a drink, instead of single-handedly dismantling half my customer base. "I'll pay for the damages." I stared at him with all 6 of my eyes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My hands were shaking as I reached for a bottle of my strongest liquor, not for him, but for me, because what I'd just seen wasn't a bar fight. It was a surgical demonstration of violence, performed by someone who knew exactly how every species in the galaxy could be broken. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice about 3 octaves higher than normal. Jake smiled, and for the first time since he'd walked in, it wasn't entirely friendly. "Jake Murphy, Terran Colonial Marines, retired." "Well, technically I'm on extended leave, but the paperwork gets complicated when you're operating in neutral space." Colonial Marines. That meant something, though I couldn't quite remember what. The human military structure was so confusing, with their armies and navies and marines, and special forces, and who knows what else. Most species just had warriors and not warriors. Humans had to make everything complicated. "You're military," I said, stating the obvious, because my brain was still trying to catch up with reality. Was military. Now I'm more of a consultant. Jake took another sip of his beer, and looked around at the carnage with professional interest. Though old habits die hard, you know. Professor Quillix was sitting up now, still shaking, but apparently recovered enough to speak. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the stunned silence of the bar, everyone could hear him. "Consultant for what?" he asked, though he sounded like he really didn't want to know the answer. Jake's smile got a little wider. "Threat assessment. See, the thing about humans is that we're really good at learning from our mistakes, and getting our asses kicked by the Vegan Trade Federation. That was educational." He turned to face the room, addressing the scattered and groaning aliens, like he was giving a lecture to a classroom full of students. "You want to know what we learned? We learned that every species in this galaxy thinks they understand warfare. The Korath think it's about strength and honor." He glanced at Commander Throck, who was still curled up on the floor holding his knee. "The Zelathi think it's about intelligence and strategy. The Dracorians think it's about speed and surprise. Everyone's got their specialty, their thing that makes them feel superior." Captain Vex was leaning against the wall, her cybernetic system still rebooting from the electrical feedback. "And humans don't?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Oh, we do. Our specialty is cheating." Jake said it like he was proud of it. "See, while everyone else was perfecting their one approach to combat, we were studying everyone else's approaches, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their cultural blind spots. We've been cataloging every species we've encountered for the past 50 years. The implications of that statement hit the room like a cold wave. I felt my secondary stomach clench as I realized what he was suggesting. "The border skirmish," I said slowly. "The one where you lost to the vegans. Did we lose?" Jake asked, and his tone was suddenly much less casual. "Or did we gather field data on 17 different species' combat doctrines, weapons systems, and tactical preferences while maintaining our cover as the galaxy's favorite underdog?" Professor Quillix made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a retch. "The crying soldiers. The retreat. Academy Award-worthy performances, every one of them." Jake raised his beer in a mock toast. "Turns out humans are pretty good actors when the stakes are high enough. And the stakes are always high when you're the weakest species in a galaxy full of predators." He walked over to where Throck was lying, and crouched down next to the massive alien. "You know what your people's weakness is, Commander. You're honorable. You fight fair. You announce your intentions, and give your enemies a chance to prepare. It's admirable. Really. But it's also predictable." Throck tried to say something, but it came out as more of a groan. Jake stood up and moved to Captain Vex. "And you cybernetic types, you rely too much on your technology. All that fancy hardware makes you faster, stronger, more accurate. But it also creates vulnerabilities that organic beings don't have. electromagnetic pulses, frequency disruption, feedback loops. A sufficiently motivated human, with a basic understanding of electronics, can turn your advantages into liabilities. Vex's cybernetic eye was flickering as her systems tried to stabilize. How do you know so much about our weaknesses? Because we've been preparing for this conversation for decades. Jake's expression was serious now, all traces of his earlier friendliness gone. Every human who's ever served in the military, worked in diplomatic corps, or even just traveled as a merchant, has been gathering intelligence. We've been building the most comprehensive threat assessment database in galactic history. He walked back to the bar and sat down on his stool like nothing had happened. See, the thing about being underestimated is that people tell you things they shouldn't. They let their guard down around you. They assume you're too stupid or weak to be a real threat. And while they're busy feeling superior, you're learning everything you need to know to destroy them. The silence in the bar was deafening. Even the aliens who hadn't been directly involved in the fight were staring at Jake with a mixture of horror and fascination. So the question isn't whether humans are a threat, Jake continued, finishing his beer. The question is whether we're a threat you want to deal with diplomatically, or whether you'd prefer to find out just how thorough our threat assessments really are. One of the Dracorian traders, his scales still smoking from the fire whiskey, managed to find his voice. You're talking about war. I'm talking about survival. Jake's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made my carapace crawl. Humans have been prey animals for our entire evolutionary history. We got good at avoiding predators, at hiding, at running away. But we also got good at something else. What? Professor Quillix whispered. Jake smiled, and this time it was genuinely terrifying. We got good at waiting for the right moment to fight back. And we got very, very good at making sure that when we do fight back, it's the last fight our enemies ever have. He placed another credit chip on the bar, enough to cover the damages, and then some. Thanks for the drinks, Krix, and the education. I think everyone here learned something valuable tonight. As he walked toward the door, every eye in the place followed him. Just before he reached the exit, he turned back to address the room one final time. Oh, and just so everyone's clear about the current situation. That border skirmish with the vegans. We didn't just gather intelligence on the 17 species that participated. We also identified and cataloged the locations of their home worlds, military installations, supply lines, and command structures. All of it. Every single piece of strategic information we'd need if this whole peace and diplomacy thing doesn't work out. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Sweet dreams, everyone. Try not to let the existential dread keep you up too late. And then he was gone, leaving behind a bar full of aliens, who suddenly realized they'd been playing checkers while humanity was playing chess. And they just found out that the game was a lot closer to checkmate than they'd thought. That was 6 months ago. And let me tell you, the galaxy hasn't been the same since. Word spread faster than a quantum cascade failure. Within hours, every intelligence agency, military command, and diplomatic corps from here to the Andromeda border had heard about the bar fight incident. That's what they're calling it now, with capital letters and everything, like it's some kind of historical event, which I suppose it is. The immediate aftermath was almost as entertaining as the fight itself. Commander Throx spent 3 days in a medical facility getting his knee reconstructed, and when he was released, the first thing he did was request a transfer to a desk job. Apparently, the idea of potentially facing humans in actual combat had cured him of his warrior spirit. The Korath Empire quietly withdrew their claims on 2 disputed systems that happened to border human space. Captain Vex disappeared entirely. Rumor has it she's somewhere in the Outer Rim, trying to develop countermeasures for electromagnetic warfare. Good luck with that. From what I understand, humans have been perfecting electronic warfare techniques since before they had faster-than-light travel. It's going to take more than a few modifications to overcome that kind of head start. Professor Quillix went completely insane for about a month. The Zelathi medical authorities said it was a form of telepathic trauma, caused by exposure to what they called an unusually organized and militaristic consciousness. When he finally recovered, he published a paper titled Reconsidering Human Cognitive Architecture in Light of Recent Evidence. It's become required reading at intelligence academies across 3 sectors. The basic thesis is that humans don't think like other species, and anyone who assumes they do is making a potentially fatal mistake. But the real changes started happening at the government level. The Vegan Trade Federation, bless their pacifist hearts, were the first to figure out the implications. Within a week of the incident, They'd opened direct diplomatic channels with Earth and started negotiating what they politely called enhanced cooperation agreements. Translation: they were desperately trying to make sure humans didn't hold grudges about that whole border skirmish thing. The Dracorian Confederacy followed suit, then the Andromedan Republic, then pretty much everyone else who'd been treating humans like a minor annoyance. Suddenly, human diplomats were getting invited to high-level strategic planning sessions. Human merchants were getting preferential trade agreements. Human colonies were receiving offers of mutual defense pacts. It's amazing how friendly everyone becomes when they realize you've been quietly preparing to end their civilization. The funniest part is watching the military analysts try to retrofit their strategic assessments. For decades, human military capabilities had been rated somewhere between negligible and mildly irritating. Now they're frantically trying to figure out what humans are actually capable of, and the more they dig, the more terrified they become. Apparently, humans have been doing this intelligence gathering thing on a scale that nobody else thought was possible. While other species focused on their immediate neighbors and obvious threats, humans were cataloging everyone. Every species, every government, every military formation they'd ever encountered. They've got detailed profiles on the psychological weaknesses of individual alien commanders, for crying out loud. And the scariest part, nobody knows how much of it is true and how much is psychological warfare. Maybe humans really do have comprehensive battle plans for conquering every major power in the galaxy. Or maybe they're just really good at making people think they do. Either way, the effect is the same. The Galactic Council held an emergency session 3 months ago to discuss what they're calling the human question. The debate lasted for 6 days and basically boiled down to one fundamental issue: nobody wants to find out if humans are bluffing. As for Jake Murphy, he's become something of a celebrity. Not the good kind of celebrity, mind you. More like the kind of celebrity that serial killers and natural disasters achieve. People are fascinated by him, but they really don't want to meet him in person. He still comes to my bar, actually. About once a week, always orders the same thing, always pays his tab, always polite as can be. The difference is that now the place clears out whenever he walks in. Word has gotten around that Zeph's Cantina is where the human drinks, and apparently nobody wants to risk being in the same room with him. Which is bad for business, but good for my nerves. Last week he brought friends, 3 other humans, all of them with that same deceptively casual demeanor that I now recognize as profoundly dangerous. They sat at a corner table, drank their beers, and had what appeared to be a perfectly normal conversation about sports and weather. The only other patron in the place was a Centauri diplomat, who'd apparently not gotten the memo about avoiding the bar. He spent the entire evening sweating through his environmental suit and jumping at every sound. When the humans finally left, the diplomat practically collapsed with relief. "Do you know what they were talking about?" he asked me, his voice shaking. I'd been listening, of course. With compound ears like mine, it's hard not to eavesdrop. "Terraform baseball scores and atmospheric pressure variations on Mars," I told him. He stared at me like I'd grown an extra head. "That's it. Sports and weather, that's it. But they're humans, shouldn't they have been discussing military strategies or invasion plans or something threatening?" I poured myself a drink, something I rarely do during business hours. "But these days, I need the chemical fortification. That's the thing about humans," I explained. "They don't need to discuss being dangerous, they just are dangerous. The threat isn't in what they talk about. The threat is in what they know, what they've prepared for, and what they're capable of doing if they decide they need to do it." The diplomat left shortly after that, probably to file a report about the terrifying ordinariness of human small talk. And that's the new reality we're all living in. Humans are still the same species they were 6 months ago. They still look harmless, still seem friendly, still lose at arm wrestling contests with species that have actual combat-rated physiology. But now everyone knows that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look like a predator at all. The galaxy has learned to be afraid of a species that fights wars by pretending to lose them, gathers intelligence by appearing incompetent, and maintains peace by making sure everyone knows they're prepared for war. And all it took was one human, one bar fight, and 90 seconds of carefully applied violence to change everything. Jake Murphy finished his beer, left his usual generous tip, and walked out into the night. Just another human, going about his business in a galaxy that now understands exactly what human business really entails. I closed the bar early that night. Some conversations require privacy, and some realizations require alcohol. Because the thing that really keeps me awake at night isn't what Jake Murphy did in my bar. It's wondering how many other Jake Murphys are out there, quietly having drinks in bars across the galaxy, politely gathering intelligence, and patiently waiting for orders that everyone hopes will never come. The humans call it peace through strength. The rest of us call it the most terrifying diplomatic policy in galactic history. And you know what the worst part is? It's working. Sweet dreams, everyone. Try not to let the existential dread keep you up too late.